You think loyalty is built on respect? That's the fairy tale they sell to the masses. In reality, loyalty is engineered through fear, confusion, and psychological traps so subtle most people never realize they've lost their freedom. You're not like the crowd who believes obedience comes from brotherhood. The crowd thinks Mafia soldiers followed orders because they wanted to. The truth? They were mentally cornered until leaving felt more dangerous than staying. And once you see these tactics, you'll start noticing them everywhere. In toxic jobs, cult-like groups, and even relationships. Let's begin with tactic number 1. 1. Ritualized initiation, turning identity into a cage. Mafia initiation wasn't just a ceremony, it was psychological surgery. New members were forced to swear oaths over religious symbols, blood, and fire. Why? Because once you mix violence with sacred imagery, the brain links obedience to morality. You're no longer just joining a group, you become the group. Psychologically, this creates identity fusion, when your personal self dissolves into the collective. Leaving doesn't feel like quitting a job. It feels like betraying your soul. And here's the dark genius. The more painful and dramatic the initiation, the stronger the loyalty. Humans instinctively value what costs them suffering. That's why Mafia bosses made rituals terrifying instead of welcoming. Pain equal sign meaning. Meaning equal sign loyalty. 2. Controlled fear. Constant, unpredictable punishment. Mafia leaders didn't punish everyone equally. They punished randomly. One soldier breaks a rule and vanishes. Another gets beaten publicly. Another is forgiven. This unpredictability keeps subordinates in a permanent state of anxiety. Psychologists call this variable reinforcement, the same system used in gambling addiction. When punishment is unpredictable, the brain becomes hyper-alert and obsessed with approval. You don't obey because you understand the rules. You obey because you're terrified of guessing wrong. And fear doesn't just silence rebellion, it kills critical thinking. When you live in survival mode, your mind stops questioning and starts obeying. 3. Manufactured dependency, cutting off the outside world. A classic Mafia tactic was isolating members from normal society. They discouraged outside friendships. They replaced families with the family. They controlled income, protection, and even housing. This creates dependency. Once all your money, safety, and belonging come from one source, that source owns you. It's not chains, it's invisible strings. If you leave, you lose. Income, protection, social identity, meaning. So staying feels safer than freedom. That's not loyalty, that's psychological captivity. 4. Reward and punishment cycles, emotional whiplash. Mafia bosses mastered emotional contrast. One day you're humiliated, next day you're praised, one moment you're threatened, next moment you're embraced. This creates trauma bonding, the same dynamic seen in abusive relationships. Your brain links pain with love, fear with belonging, violence with validation, and soon, approval from the boss becomes addictive. You're not working for money anymore. You're working for emotional relief. Now notice something important. None of these tactics rely on physical chains. They rely on psychological architecture. That's why they still work today, in corporations, extremist groups, and manipulative leaders. The masses believe power comes from strength, but real power comes from controlling how people think, feel, and identify. And we've only covered the first 4. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The most effective prison is the one where inmates become their own guards. Mafia leaders understood this better than anyone. They didn't just control behavior. They controlled conscience. That's where the next tactics come in. 5. Weaponized guilt, making you responsible for your own chains. Once a subordinate committed crimes for the organization, the trap was set. Every illegal act became psychological leverage. You're one of us now. You've crossed the line. There's no going back. This isn't just a threat, it's identity manipulation. The brain hates cognitive dissonance, the pain of believing I am a good person while doing bad things. So to resolve it, members reframe violence as loyalty, crime as honor, obedience as virtue. Now leaving doesn't feel like escape, it feels like confession, and guilt becomes a leash. Because the more immoral acts you commit, the harder it is to imagine a life outside the group. You're not trapped by bars. You're trapped by your own history. 6. sacred secrecy, turning silence into a moral law. The Mafia didn't just forbid talking, they turned silence into a sacred code. Breaking it wasn't framed as betrayal of a boss. It was betrayal of the family, the dead, the tradition, and the identity. This is psychological genius. When secrecy becomes moral, fear becomes righteous. Now the subordinate isn't just scared of punishment. They're scared of being the kind of person who talks, which means even when abused, they stay silent. Even when exploited, they defend the system. Even when trapped, they protect the trap. This creates internal censorship. The leader doesn't need to watch everyone. Everyone watches themselves. 7. Moral reversal, redefining good and evil. This is the most dangerous tactic of all. Mafia leaders didn't say, "We are criminals." They said, "We are protectors." Violence became justice. Extortion became business. Murder became necessity. They reframed cruelty as duty. Why? Because humans will do almost anything if they believe they're doing it for a higher purpose. Once morality flips, logic disappears. A subordinate can witness brutality and feel proud. They can harm outsiders and feel righteous. They can betray their own values and call it loyalty. At that point, control is complete. The system no longer needs threats. It runs on belief. Now step back and look at the pattern. First, identity is fused. Then fear is installed. Then dependency is created. Then emotional addiction is formed. Then guilt locks the door. Then secrecy seals it. Then morality is rewritten. This is not random cruelty. It's a psychological blueprint. And here's what should make you uneasy. These same tactics appear today in toxic workplaces, manipulative leaders, cult-like communities, abusive relationships, different costumes. Same psychology. The masses think manipulation looks loud and violent, but the real version is quiet and internal. It feels like, I chose this. I deserve this. I can't leave. This is who I am now. That's when power becomes invisible. Here's the final layer of control, and the most diabolical one. Mafia leaders didn't just dominate their subordinates, they turned them against each other. Because a united group is dangerous. A divided group is obedient. 8. Engineered rivalry, making brothers compete instead of unite. Mafia bosses deliberately created competition between soldiers. They gave favoritism to some, they humiliated others. They spread rumors quietly. They rewarded loyalty selectively. No one knew where they stood. This created paranoia. Every subordinate began asking, is he closer to the boss than me? Is he talking about me? Am I next? And when everyone is suspicious of everyone, no one organizes rebellion. This tactic hijacks a basic human instinct. We crave status and recognition. So instead of questioning authority, subordinates fought for approval. They didn't look up. They looked sideways. The boss became the only stable reference point. Everyone else became a threat. That's not leadership. That's psychological chess. Why these tactics work so well? Notice something powerful. Each tactic alone is strong, but together they form a closed system. Identity fusion makes you belong. Fear makes you obey. Dependency makes you stay. Emotional cycles make you addicted. Guilt makes you ashamed. Secrecy makes you silent. Moral reversal makes you proud. Rivalry makes you isolated. At that point, escape doesn't feel possible, because leaving would cost your identity, your safety, your community, your meaning, your past. And the brain always chooses the pain it knows over the freedom it doesn't. The warning signs in your own life. Now here's where this gets personal. You don't need to be in a mafia to be under psychological control. Watch for these red flags. 1. Your identity is tied to one group or person. If leaving feels like losing yourself, that's a trap. 2. Fear replaces logic. You obey not because it makes sense, but because you're afraid of consequences. 3. Outside relationships are discouraged. Anyone who isolates you is trying to own you. 4. You feel guilty for questioning. Curiosity becomes betrayal. 5. Morality becomes flexible. Things you once found wrong now feel justified. 6. You compete instead of connect. Everyone feels like a rival, not an ally. These are not random problems. They are signs of manipulation architecture. How to break psychological control. Mafia leaders feared only one thing: awareness. Because control only works when it's invisible. The moment you name the pattern, it weakens. Here's the counter strategy. Reclaim identity. You are more than any role, job, or group. Reconnect outside the system. Independent relationships dissolve dependency. Question moral shortcuts. If harm is justified by loyalty, something is wrong. Refuse emotional extremes. Stable environments don't need fear to function. Build horizontal trust. When people unite instead of compete, control collapses. Power hates cooperation. The masses believe manipulation is obvious. They imagine shouting, threats, and violence. But the most dangerous control feels normal. It feels like duty. It feels like belonging. It feels like love. That's why so many people stay in systems that harm them. And now you see the blueprint. You can never be controlled the same way again. If this changed how you see power and loyalty, then you already broke the first chain.